Well, I can't resist starting by echoing and applauding what the last speaker had to say. And I would just add a slightly different twist on it. That is, no politician will ever spontaneously decide to limit consumption or decide to preach to people about population, or really put very much pressure on technology, especially with the operations of Citizens United and groups like that, unless you and the people in this room had better be the ones who get started, unless you're willing to put some effort into it. At Earth Day in 1970, 20 million people came out and demonstrated, and it's small. That was 1 out of every 10 people in the United States. It would be the equivalent of 333 million people, 35 million people today coming out and demonstrating. And if 35 million people would come out today and demonstrate, it would make a big difference politically. But believe me, you can't count on any politician, international or national, to do it spontaneously. I know the last two speakers were deliberately trying to be very cheerful, and I hope I don't change the mood of it too badly. But I did, as Dan predicted, wanted to say a little bit about my own experience in California. The Earth, of course, is based on biodiversity. It's based on the interactions between plants and animals that we all love so much, and into which we evolved about 2.2 million years ago, and on which we depend entirely for our continued life on Earth. And California is one of the most spectacular and wonderful places in the world to see and think about this biological diversity. And small wonder that such a flourishing group of California native plant society would be existing here in California, where there is such a fantastic diversity of plants to depend on. This always reminds me of Herb Cain's great quote, "A true Californian is one who believes that the hills are naturally a golden brown, interrupted briefly in winter by a greenish scum which soon disappears, returning to their natural glory." Unfortunately, the greenish scum hasn't been seen recently. This year it looks a little better. I hope it will stay a little better. But there is no, I remember once I came in with my mother in San Francisco and I said, "I've just been in the Adirondacks and it was so beautiful." And she said, "You're so good to say somewhere outside of California is beautiful. You know, we're always taught to believe the only place that's beautiful is California." And actually, when you think about it, you can see why. From the coast over the mountains into the desert is one of the most fantastic and beautiful assemblages of plants and interesting assemblages of animals and other biodiversity found anywhere on Earth. And I just illustrate this by the unexpected discovery of the Tejon buckwheat, a very beautiful species of Eriogonum on the Tejon Ranch nearly 10 years ago. And I can also use this to commemorate Jim Reveal, our very good compatriot who passed away just a few days ago and was the premier student of buckwheats and one of the co-authors of this species. The Earth went along pretty well for nearly 2.2 million years with people hunting and gathering, but when people began to develop agriculture in the world, there were only, estimates vary a little bit, obviously nobody was around there counting them, but there was something like 1 million people, 1 million people in the entire world 10,000 years ago. 100,000 people were the entire population of Europe. Agriculture began to be developed about 12,000 years ago after 2.2 million years of history, and became a mainstay for human populations about 10,000 years ago. Language, a written language, was developed about halfway here, about 5,000 years ago. And from 1 million people, 10,000 years ago, with the population shot upward with the availability of food in the off seasons and other amenities that were not present before, in the way that's shown in the last 500 years in this diagram. You can see some interesting things here. For example, when Thomas Malthus was talking about the inability of human beings to feed themselves, there were about 850 million people in the world. It was before the world population had reached 1 billion in the 1790s. It didn't reach 1 billion until 1804. It took 123 years to reach 2 billion. In between World War I and World War II, in 1960 it reached 3 billion, and so forth. Now I wanted to lay out some of this in terms of my own life as a reminder to myself, and perhaps as a reminder to you how fast things have changed. The current world population, to review that first, is 7.2 billion. I don't know where Paul got this silly and optimistic view that there might be only 7 billion people in the year 2050, but God, I hope he's right. Some people think there'll be 9.7 billion, but Paul is always over-optimistic. 2100 in 11 billion people, and the UN has recently said that there's no real reason that it should stop at that. One of the most frightening statistics to me is that we have a net of about 100,000 extra people every day. There are about 100,000 more people to feed every day. About 40 to 50,000 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa alone. And any adjustment we do will have to take that into account, because any adjustment we do or anything we do that's intelligent will have to deal with that kind of growth. 800 million people received so little food during their lives that they're malnourished in the sense that their bodies and brains haven't developed properly. About 100 million people somewhere in the world are on the verge of starvation at any given time. Paul is sometimes criticized for talking about people starving, and it's true that only some hundreds of millions of people have starved to death since he wrote his book, so probably it was a little pessimistic, particularly given that those were scenarios and not predictions. But he did a great service in calling our attention to the enormous pressures on the global environment. Now, that's me. In the 1930s. In the 1930s, California's population was 6.2 million people, and the world population was 2.1 million people. So when that picture was taken, that's how many people there were in the world and how many people there were in California. Consider that there are well over 3 times that many people in the world now, and well over 6 times that many people in California, and you get an idea of what's going on. That's also me. That's in the mid-1950s on a Sierra Club base camp outing on Crabtree Creek south of Mount Whitney, looking at plants and being a naturalist. By that time, California's population has grown to about a quarter of what it is now, and the world population had grown to something about a third of what it is now. But that's just 1955. That's during a single, the reason I'm stressing this is a single human lifetime. That's me in the late 60s. What can I say? That's what we did in the late 60s. That is on Jasper Ridge when I was on the faculty at Stanford. Jasper Ridge is the famous place where Paul Ehrlich, through his experiments, drove Euphydrius edithabaensis to extinction. I can only hope that the biological facts that he found out and trumpeted widely were worth driving this beautiful butterfly off the planet. Actually, I'm a co-founder of the field of coevolution too, and it really started with observations of that butterfly on Jasper Ridge. If I'd gotten to Stanford later and Paul had already driven it to extinction, we probably never would have had that idea. 1969, which is about when that picture was taken, God help us, those were the days. The California population was around 20 million, the world population 3.6 billion, but still only half of what it is now. And the rate of growth by percentage reached an all-time high in 1971, and of course Paul and Ann, both of whom are here today, conceived the population bomb as we all were fretting about population at Stanford in the late 60s, and timed its publication to try to affect the election that was coming up at that time. it certainly did have a major effect on people's choices about family size, and they're to be greatly congratulated for that effort, as the previous speaker has already done. Now, if you talk about consumption, I always think these two pictures drive it home more easily than anything else. This is a week of food for an African family of 5 people, 3 children. And this is a week of food for a Western European or American family for a family of 4 children. If you compare those two, you can get an idea of how consumption varies around the world, and you can get an idea of how anxious politicians will be to spread the wealth all over the world in countries like the United States, which uses about half of our internal capacity, or countries like Japan, which uses about 7 times its internal capacity to support its population. I can just see the populations getting up and saying, we have to cut our consumption to 40% of what it is now because we have to be able to give food to the people in West Africa. Don't forget that those are the same places that Ebola is spreading rapidly and where there's so much difficulty. Don't ever forget that the world is one place, and that when you think about conserving plants in California, you have to think about the long-term future of that, which the previous speaker has cast probably sufficient doubt on already, in the world context. The Global Footprint Network, which is a think tank housed in Oakland, they're still a little different. Our daughter is a public defender in Oakland, so if you get into trouble there, give me a phone call. Compares biocapacity, how much bioproductive area is available to the world or to an individual country, and how much bioproductive area do we demand to support our consumption levels. The website is on the bottom of that page, and I would urge every single one of you, footprintnetwork.org, to look that up and think about the relationship that they make between the demands here on the environment and what that means to the way we live. So how much of the world's sustainable productivity are we using up right now? In other words, the world has a certain capacity to refresh itself, and how much of that are we using now? Well, the Global Footprint Network estimates that we were using about 70% in 1970, and we're using about 156% now, which simply means that past August, we're using the productive capacity in a non-renewable way, in a way that drives the diversity and wonder and beauty of the world steadily downhill. We need 50% more productivity than exists on this planet. And the problem with that 50% more productivity is that it wouldn't make anything any better. It wouldn't alleviate the 800 million people who are malnourished or the 100 million who are on the edge of starvation. It would simply keep systems going in a relatively intact form. And that's the ghastly point about all of this. If you look at nations, those wonderful vehicles that we devise so well to be able to divide up the world's goods, parens in our own benefit, close parens. Here's Global Footprint Network's map of ecological creditors and ecological debtors. This is 1961. Darker green is producing more of its own goods. Darker brown, less of its own goods. And wait till you see the next picture. This is 1961. This is 2005. Every one of those countries in brown depends on other countries around the world to supply itself. It cannot produce enough internally to provide the standard of living that they enjoy at the present time. And so it may not seem surprising that China and the United States are working all over the world to get food, to grow food, to rent land, to buy land, and so forth, because we simply don't have it internally. Look here on the ordinate at global hectares per capita. Global hectares per capita for the population of a country on the ordinate, and then years on the abscissa, and you can see that Great Britain, a colonial country, has been not surprisingly, been way beyond its own internal capacity for a very long time, and has depended on the existence of an empire in order to be able to feed itself and support its standard of living. But again, remember the standard is about 4 to 5 hectares, the available capacity about 1 to 2. Now look at the United States. here, as our population has grown about as rapidly as any country on Earth, we've driven the global hectares per capita down rapidly from about nearly 7 to about 4, and we've kept our ecological footprint at about the same place. So the two lines crossed at about 1965. Remember that we're up around 4, 6, 8 on the ordinate, and then look here at this map of where China is, and you'll begin to understand some of the pressures. With 1.3 billion people, they have about not quite 1.5 hectares per capita, which they're driving downhill slowly, and their consumption is pouring upward. We have a tendency to look on the successive nations in a capitalistic scheme as based on their own internal capacity and their ability to develop, whereas actually the successive nations in a capitalistic scheme depends on their ability to import goods from all over the world. And that's where I'm going to argue in a few minutes at the end of this that one of the most important things we can all do is persuade one another, and especially our politicians, to think internationally. Because we tend to think nationally, we tend to think the only problems we have here are whether people come in and too many people come in from Mexico, or we forgive them, or we don't, or what happens. I always laugh at the projections for Christmas sales, which usually project if they don't rise at least 4% a year, it's an economic disaster. And I think any of you had any math at all can calculate about when that would reach infinity. And then if we have infinity spent on Christmas sales, we're in really deep trouble. So something's got to give along the way, as our earlier speaker said so well. The Brundtland Report in 1987, which popularized the term sustainability, lies, in my mind, on a complete myth. And the myth is that all countries in the world, if they act smart and do well, can develop to the level of the United States and Western Europe. But I hope I've demonstrated by the earlier projections there's just not enough goods there. Nations are about the worst way you can imagine for people to vie with one another. It's based on the scheme that originated when the population began to grow, where you put yourself under the aegis of a strong protector like a king or pharaoh or something, then you fight for them and then you get all the goods you can. But the problem is, when you're already using up more than there is there, you can't go on doing it anymore. I won't spend time on this since we're late, but the line there on the left, this is the position of individual nations, and I suggest on their website you look at this. You can see the USA way off on the right. Well, the red line towards the left is the line of what's available on Earth. So if in achieving a Human Development Index rating, which is rising on the ordinate, going up there and going to the right of the red line on Earth, that means it's untenable and unsupportable in the long run. You have to be left of that line. Everybody has to be left of that line ultimately, even though discoveries can be made and things can be done to improve it. It's fascinating that Cuba is left of that line, and then you see Sierra Leone at the very bottom on the left. Here's the global footprint network's overshot scenarios. If we go on business as usual, we'll be up to needing 2.2 Earths by the year 2100. To get down, we'll need a fantastic revolution, a driving down of population, a stabilization of population, and hopefully a lowering of population, a lowering of consumption over much of the world, and great improvements in technology. And again, those are political things that are simply not going to happen if people like us don't take the lead. There's no way that politicians are going to innovate in driving things like that for no reason. We used to joke when I was at Stanford with Paul that we could import people, we could export people to other habitable planets, something our previous speaker alluded to, and I think we jokingly said, if you use the entire gross economic product of the world, you could export 12 people a year. And then we agreed that we all had 12 people that we'd like to export. That probably wouldn't solve the problem. A brief word about biodiversity. We hope to build the future on biodiversity because those are the only sustainable systems we have on Earth. And they're our great riches. They're the single unique thing about Earth that would make anybody that just make us unique. We're driving biodiversity to extinction at an unprecedented rate, despite our utter dependence on it for food and medicine, for ecosystem services, in water runoff and all, and for the sheer joy of the beauty of the out of doors. But all of those things fade rapidly with human activities operating at the level at which they are. Stuart Pym headed a group of us who estimated the rate of extinction in the world recently. We based this on about 12 million species of non-bacterial organisms, of which about 2 million have been named so far, and which, as you'll see in a minute, we're driving to extinction very rapidly, even though we know nothing about most of them. Biodiversity is, in the final analysis, all we have. We lost, you can study groups of organisms with hard shells over the last 65 million years since the end of the Cretaceous period, and you can say that about 10 million per year have gone extinct in that period of time. In the last 500 years, the same as that population projection, when you have movable types, you can report the loss of the dodo and other birds and so forth, and you get an idea. In the literature, it's gone up about 100 species per million per year. Now it's about 1,000 per million per year. Soon could approach 100,000, not per million, but 100,000 per year. And if it goes on at that rate, half the species on Earth could be gone in this century. Now, when I was at Stanford with Paul, we were teaching that all genetics was to the genetics of Escherichia coli. When we finally got to that point, now, with epigenetics, with gene control, and all the other things that are going on, we don't even know what the genetics are in most organisms on Earth, just for one simple point of why we should want to keep them around. It's utterly astonishing for a dyed-in-the-wool population biologist like myself to hear a good lecture in molecular biology at the present day. Now, one of the things, people always say, tisk, they controlled weeds in agriculture and drove species to extinction. Just as an interesting sidebar, how many species do you think were lost when we converted 11% of the world's land surface to crop agriculture and another 20% of the world's land surface to grazing? Most of it on natural grasslands and unsustainable. We must have lost millions of species in the last 10,000 years. And perhaps in the Pacific, where we lost over 1,500 species of birds since the Polynesian migration, and you can read a lovely article about that if you do subscribe to MAHB, as Paul suggested graciously. He wrote a fine article on bird extinction in the Pacific. We've lost millions of species to that anyway. How many species do you think have been lost in Mediterranean Europe, for example? Global climate change is the new thing. It was one of the horrors we didn't even have to think about in the mid-1960s, even though it's been known since the 1890s with Arrhenius to be a theoretical fact. And yet it will drive species to extinction. It will add to the whole problem very rapidly indeed as we lose all the above timberline and near timberline lands, habitats in the lower 48 states, for example, over the next several decades. And that seems to be pretty well inevitable. Droughts and other phenomena, other climate phenomena that are associated with this, and I hope you all follow the Pacific Water Institute, where Peter Glick, one of our colleagues, is the head, and which analyzes many of these things very well. Many bad things go along with it, and of course one of the things about global climate change is we just don't know where you reach the breaking point and where things start to go really bad. So those are extinction pressures. Most species will never have been seen, and yet we can save them a bit by creating parks, particularly if they have steep elevations, and they can migrate a bit in terms of global climate change by growing some of them in botanical gardens or zoos or what have you, and by seed banks where the seeds can be stored against the possibility of habitats being available in an uncertain future. But if you really want to save species, and this is why I'm preaching to the California Native Plant Society, you've got to get to a much bigger picture. As has already been said very clearly, population stability is a sine qua non of the whole situation. Social justice, empowering women, is absolutely essential to receiving that. Global warming must be stopped. Alternative energy sources have to be developed. And so it goes. Otherwise, conservation in the United States is sort of like conservation on a rowboat out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. California may seem like an island, and you may feel that way sometimes, but actually it isn't. If you think about children all over the world and women and how very badly off they are and how little they can contribute, it really becomes not only socially unjust, but incredibly stupid if you think about the brain power that cannot be applied to human problems as a result of our lack of caring about it. What if the second boy from the right there had the musical ability of Beethoven? What difference would it make? There you are. What if he had a solution? In dealing with this as individuals, I always put number one, promoting international understanding, because if we don't have more international understanding in the United States, we're not going to get anywhere. It depends on people all over the world working together. And to do that in a world where we barely even care about our own poor and sick and disadvantaged people is just not a go to separate that, to spread that around the world unless we really push international understanding. Facts about the environment change rapidly. It doesn't do any good just to keep confronting one another. You have to keep learning about it, and then you have to keep teaching others about it. You have to act on what you find and learn. And you have to vote. You have to get people in power who will make these changes. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. It often can be very complicated. This is the Ivanpah solar array in the Mojave Desert. And as you may know, it's very good in terms of producing energy. But there's a great controversy about it. Namely, it endangers the desert tortoise. Wind farms off Cape Cod were attacked because they ruined the scenery and they were taken down. We have to do something. We are not living in a pristine world where the bad things can go on far out of our view. We're living in a world where we have to think about compromises. The worst thing about this picture is that this desert tortoise has the presumption of eating one of the species of plants that I studied for my doctoral dissertation. My students have changed the names of genera in the family so often since that I have no idea whatever this is called. But I know it's kids. Please remember kids. They are the future. Remember Werner Arber, the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, said at our recent meeting, he's the first non-Catholic chancellor, he said at our recent meeting, and it goes in well with the last speaker, remember, don't just worry about your children and grandchildren. Well, we all said, heck, we just worry about ourselves. Who worries about their children and grandchildren? Said, worry about whether our civilization can survive another 50 or 100 years. Whether the wonderful things that we built up, most of them in the last 10,000 years since the development of agriculture, are going to be able to persist and to be enjoyed, whether poetry is going to be able to be enjoyed, music, all the other things that we value, writing, storytelling, what have you. But bringing kids into the loop is one of the most powerful things we can do, and it's a very good argument itself for many of your activities in preserving native flora around the places where you live. So should we be, in conclusion, should we be optimists or pessimists? I think Gandhi said it very well when he said, it depends on each one of us. The world provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed. I think that says it very well, and you might think about that when you drive past your own 4 Hummers parked in the garage. Here are a couple of quotes that I especially like. Dan Jansen in the 1960s, 50 years ago, said this, and I think that's one of the great truths that we have to keep in mind. The earth is a garden, and we are all the gardeners. Stuart Brand, who started the Coevolution Quarterly, said later, and now the Whole Earth Catalog said later, if we're going to act like gods, we should try to get good at it. I think that's a very good sign too. The Earth is not going to be saved by repeated acts of selfishness on individual parts and on the parts of nations, groups, universities, or anything else. It's going to be solved on human intelligence brought to bear on the problems. And then finally, Dan, just a couple of summers ago said, and this is very pertinent to the California Native Plant Society, if we don't save it now, we can't save it later. I think that sounds so simple, and yet when you think about it, there's plenty to care about. We might not care that Paul drove that butterfly to extinction, but we should care. Actually, he didn't. It vanished under his loving care. And so, there's plenty to care about. We all care about plenty. If we want to save it, if we want to really keep this thing going, we've got to pay a lot more attention than we do. We've got to tax ourselves to become more active, to do things, to get out there and show people that we care what happens to the world, and we're not content just to sit around like dumb rocks waiting to see what happens to us next while we drive around in our Humvees. Besides, I don't like Humvees. We have a Porsche. No.